The morning Eliza Hawthorne walked into Maddox feed and grain with her wedding ring pinched between her fingers, the sky above Caldwell, Kansas was the pale, bruised color of a healing wound, and she had not slept in 3 days. She had cried in the dark until there were no more tears left, and then she had stared at the ceiling of the farmhouse that smelled of cedar and old leather and the ghost of her husband's pipe smoke, and she had made her calculations with the cold, hard arithmetic of survival. The ring was gold, the soil was cracked, the children needed to eat. And if she did not put seed into that ground within the next 2 weeks, there would be nothing left of everything James Hawthorne had spent 9 years building from raw Kansas prairie. Caldwell in the spring of 1878 was a town still finding itself, perched on the edge of the Chisholm Trail where cattle drives rumbled through and left behind clouds of red dust, and the distant music of cowboy songs drifting from the saloons on Delaware Street. It was a town of rough edges and sharp ambitions, of men who had come west to become something and women who had followed them and often stayed long after the men were gone. The Cherokee Strip lay just beyond the southern border, a reminder that this land had its own complicated history, that the ground beneath Eliza's boots had been walked upon by people whose presence the country was still trying to erase, and that nothing about life on the frontier had ever been simple or fair or clean. Eliza Hawthorne was 28 years old. She had come to Kansas as a bride of 19 with soft hands and a leather-bound journal full of pressed wildflowers, and she had become, through 9 years of prairie wind and hard work, a woman whose hands were calloused and whose eyes held something steady and unbreakable at their center. She was not tall, but she stood as if she were. Her dark hair was always pulled back, though the wind never let it stay that way for long, and her face had the kind of beauty that came from character rather than convenience, all strong angles and expressions that moved across it like weather. James had loved her completely. She had loved him completely. And then a fever had taken him in January, 10 days before the new year had even settled into itself, and Eliza had been left alone with 2 children, 40 acres of Kansas farmland, and the particular silence that follows the end of something irreplaceable. Thomas was 7. Ruth was 5. They were good children in the way that children raised on frontier farms are good, which is to say they understood work and weather, and that some questions did not have comfortable answers. They ate the last of the flour on a Tuesday, and on Wednesday morning, Eliza had stood at the kitchen window looking at the empty fields and the ring on her finger, and she had made her decision with the same quiet steadiness with which she made every decision now. She walked the 1.5 miles into Caldwell because the horse was still alive, and she needed it more than she needed the comfort of riding. She wore her good dress, which was not very good anymore, a dark blue wool that had been let out at the seams once already, and her boots, which still held their shape even if the soles were thinning. She carried the ring in the front pocket of the dress where she could feel it against her palm, and she walked past the stockyards and the hotel and the newspaper office and the saloon where 2 cowboys were already arguing about something in loud, companionable voices, and she pushed open the door of Maddox feed and grain. The smell hit her first. Oats and barley and something earthy and fundamental, the smell of potential, of things that had not yet grown. The store was long and low-ceilinged, with burlap sacks stacked along the walls and iron tools hanging from the rafters and barrels of various grains, lined up like soldiers along the left side of the room. Morning light came through a single large window and fell in a long gold rectangle across the wooden floor. Dust motes drifted through it peacefully. The man behind the counter looked up from the ledger he was working on, and Eliza saw him fully in that first moment. Tall, with broad shoulders that had known real work, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw shadowed with several days of beard. His eyes were brown, the warm, deep brown of turned earth, and they had lines at the corners that came from squinting into sun rather than from laughter, though she would learn later that he laughed easily when something deserved it. He wore a simple cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his hands on the counter were large and capable-looking. There was nothing flashy about Elijah Maddox. He was as straightforward and solid as the building that bore his name, and he looked at Eliza with an attention that was respectful and unguarded at the same time. "Morning," he said. His voice was unhurried, a low baritone that did not seem to need to fill space unnecessarily. "Good morning," Eliza said. She walked to the counter and she set the ring down on the wooden surface between them without preamble, without theater, because she had decided on the walk over that she would not make this harder than it had to be by being ashamed of it. The ring was a simple gold band with a small engraved pattern of leaves around the circumference. It had been on her finger for 9 years. "I need seed grain, winter wheat and corn enough for 40 acres. I do not have money. I have this. I would like to know if you will make that trade." Elijah Maddox looked at the ring. He did not pick it up immediately. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand properly before he responds to it, and then he looked at her, and his expression was not pity, which was the thing she had most feared. It was something more careful and more respectful than pity. It was recognition. He recognized that she had not come here easily. "You're the Hawthorne widow," he said, not unkindly. It was simply what people called her in town. "Eliza Hawthorne," she said, because she had a name and she preferred it. "Eliza Hawthorne," he repeated, and something in the way he said it, taking care with it, correcting his own shorthand without being asked twice, made her feel seen in a way she had not expected. "I heard about James. I'm sorry for your loss. He was a decent man." "He was," she said. She kept her chin level. "He was a very decent man." Elijah looked at the ring again. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that Eliza felt her heart beginning to climb toward her throat, because she had not made a second plan. There was no second plan. This was everything she had left of any monetary value, and she needed that grain, and if he said no, she was not entirely sure what she would do next. "I'll get the grain," he said finally. "What kind of seed stock do you need? You said winter wheat and corn. You thinking of putting all 40 acres in or leaving some fallow?" Eliza blinked. She had prepared herself for negotiation. She had not quite prepared herself for him to simply say yes and move directly to logistics, and the speed of his agreement, the way he moved past the moment of transaction and into the practical details, filled her with a relief so sudden and complete that it was almost physical, a loosening in her chest that left her briefly unable to speak. "About 30 acres planted," she managed. 10 fallow. Maybe more corn in the south field where the soil has more moisture. He nodded, already moving toward the sacks along the wall. "Smart. I have a good wheat variety out of Missouri that's been doing well in this climate, and I've got yellow dent corn that's reliable in your rainfall conditions." He was not looking at her as he said this. He was pulling quantities and checking sacks, and doing the arithmetic of her fields in his head with what seemed like practiced ease. And Eliza watched him work and thought about how strange it was that, in this worst season of her life, in this moment of enormous humiliation and grief and desperation, the man behind the counter of a feed store was treating her simply as a farmer with a farm, a person with a plan. And it felt like the most dignified thing anyone had done for her since James died. She watched him measure and fill, and set aside what she would need. He did not talk to fill the silence unnecessarily, but when he did speak, it was always something useful, something about the soil or the timing of planting or which direction to orient her rows relative to the prevailing Kansas winds. He knew this land. She could hear it in every specific, practical observation he made. When he had assembled everything she would need, he set it all out near the door and wrote the amounts in his ledger. Then he walked back to the counter. The ring was still sitting where she had left it, and he picked it up for the first time. He held it in his palm and looked at it for a long moment, turning it so the light caught the engraved leaves. Then he looked at her. "I'm going to load this onto my wagon and bring it out to your farm," he said. "You shouldn't have to carry all this back by yourself." "I didn't bring a wagon," she said, and realized only as she said it how foolish that had been, how desperate she had been that morning, how little she had been thinking beyond getting here and making this work. "I know," he said simply, without judgment. "I have one." She opened her mouth to protest that she did not need his charity beyond what had already been agreed, and he held up a hand. "I do deliveries. It's not charity, it's the way I do business." He paused. "You need anything else while you're here? Feed for livestock?" "I have 1 horse," she said carefully, "and 6 chickens." He added a small sack of oats to the pile near the door without comment. It was not until they were loading the wagon together, working side by side in the bright morning light with the sounds of Caldwell doing its daily business around them, that Eliza noticed he had not kept the ring. He set it on the wagon seat between them, wrapped carefully in a clean piece of cloth that he had produced from his shirt pocket without ceremony. She looked at it. "You should keep that," she said. "That was the trade." "I know what the trade was," he said. He settled the last sack in the wagon bed and brushed his hands on his trousers and turned to look at her with those steady brown eyes. "But I've been thinking, and I'd rather work out a different arrangement if you're agreeable to it. That ring was your husband's ring. It should stay with your family." Eliza felt something tighten in her throat. "I cannot pay you what it's worth in cash, not for a long time. Maybe not this year even if the harvest is good." "I wasn't thinking cash," he said. He climbed up onto the wagon seat and looked down at her with an expression that was careful and serious and free of any condescension. "I was thinking you could sell me grain at harvest. Whatever excess you bring in above what your family needs to eat through the winter. Fair market price, and we count it against what you owe. If the harvest is poor, we work something else out. Crops are uncertain. That's not news to either of us." Eliza stood in the sunlight with the dust of Caldwell around her, and she looked at this man who had just offered her something she had not known how to ask for, which was time, and she did not know what to say. She had spent 3 months since James died learning the shape of a world that did not wait for widows to catch their breath, a world of creditors and hard winters and social expectation, that a woman alone could not manage 40 acres of Kansas farmland. And here was a man who was simply offering her a structure, a business arrangement that treated her like she was capable of holding up her end of it. "Why?" she said, because she had to know. He thought about the question with the same seriousness with which he had considered the ring. "Because it makes more sense than melting down a woman's wedding ring," he said finally. "And because you'll plant that grain better than most of the men I sell to, from the sound of it." He paused. "Your husband talked about your farm sometimes when he came in, said you had a better instinct for soil than he did." Eliza had to look away at that. She had not known James said that to anyone. The idea of it, James talking about her to this man in this store with that quiet pride in his voice, was almost more than she could hold right now. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. The ring in its cloth wrap sat between them, and she picked it up and put it in her dress pocket with careful, deliberate hands, and then she sat with her spine straight and her eyes forward as Elijah clicked to the horse and they rolled out of Caldwell and onto the road that led toward her farm. They rode mostly in comfortable silence, which surprised her. She had expected him to fill the space with the kind of well-meaning commentary that people used when they were uncomfortable around grief, platitudes and reassurances that meant well and landed badly. But Elijah Maddox seemed to have made his peace with silence, and so they rode through the bright Kansas morning with the birds in the cottonwood trees and the distant lowing of cattle somewhere to the south. And Eliza watched her land come into view as they topped the last rise and felt, for the first time since January, something that was not quite hope, but was pointed in that direction. The farm looked better in spring than it had looked in the gray dead of winter. The fields were brown and empty, but the soil was good, dark and deep, and the house still stood straight and solid, the house James had built with his own hands over the first 2 summers after they arrived. The kitchen garden along the south wall was beginning to show the earliest green of the seeds she had managed to put in from last year's stock. The barn was sound. The fence along the east pasture needed some work, but everything else held. Thomas and Ruth were in the yard when the wagon rolled up, and they stood together watching it approach with the particular wariness of children who had learned that unexpected visitors sometimes brought news that changed things. Eliza climbed down from the wagon before it had fully stopped and went to them and put a hand on each of their heads. "It's all right," she said. "This is Mr. Maddox from the feed store in town. He's bringing us what we need to plant." Ruth, who was 5 and therefore unencumbered by the social caution her brother had developed, looked at Elijah with frank assessment. "You're tall," she announced. "I've been told that," he said seriously. "Did you bring food?" she asked. "Ruth," Eliza said. "It's a fair question," Elijah said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite a smile but was its precursor, a warmth that the question had invited out of him. He looked at Eliza. "I have some hardtack in the box under the seat, if that's useful." Eliza felt the pride that was constantly warring with necessity, and necessity won the way it always did. "Thank you," she said quietly. Thomas helped unload the wagon without being asked, which made Elijah look at him with the same quiet respect he had offered Eliza, the look of a man who recognized useful work being done without ceremony. Eliza noticed that. She noticed the way Elijah treated her son not as a poor fatherless child to be pitied, but as a small person engaged in the real business of keeping a farm operational, and it did something to the tight knot of grief and protectiveness that had lived in her chest since January. When the unloading was done, Elijah did not linger. He said he had deliveries to get back to, and he touched the brim of his hat in farewell, and he drove back down the road toward Caldwell, and Eliza stood in the yard watching the wagon until it was a small dark shape in the distance and then nothing at all. She started planting the next morning. She planted with the rhythm that James had taught her in their first years, the careful spacing, the attention to depth and moisture, the reading of the soil's particular character in each different section of the field. Thomas walked the rows with her after school, doing the parts a 7-year-old could do, and she found that working beside him in the evenings was the closest thing to comfort she had found since James died. Ruth brought them water from the well and reported on the chickens with great seriousness, and the farm moved into the slow, purposeful rhythm of a planting season. 3 days after Elijah had brought the grain, Eliza rode into Caldwell for supplies she could not defer, and she stopped at the feed store not because she needed anything, but because she felt she owed him some kind of accounting, some acknowledgement of the arrangement they had made. She found him rearranging inventory in the back of the store, and he looked up when she came in with an expression of uncomplicated welcome. "How's it looking out there?" he asked. "I've got half the south field in," she said. "The soil's better than it looked after the winter. I think we'll be all right." He nodded. "The rains have been decent this month. Good timing." She did not mean to stay long. She had other errands. But somehow they ended up talking about soil drainage and crop rotation, and the particular challenges of the south field's slightly heavier clay content for nearly 40 minutes, and she left feeling lighter than she had in months, not because he had said anything designed to make her feel better, but because he had talked to her about real things as if she were a real person engaged in real work. And that was, she was beginning to understand, exactly what she needed most. She came back the following week. And the week after that. Always with a reason, always with a practical question or a piece of information to share, but always feeling, as she made her way to the feed store, a quickening of something she was not yet ready to name. She began to learn him in pieces, the way you learn any person who does not offer themselves all at once. She learned that he had come to Caldwell from Missouri 7 years ago, that he had built the feed store himself, that he had no family in Kansas, that he played chess with the Methodist minister on Thursday evenings, and that he could discuss the specific growing properties of a dozen different wheat varieties with the focused enthusiasm of someone who genuinely found this interesting rather than merely useful. She learned that he was thoughtful in a particular way, which was to say that he thought before he spoke, but he did not use his thinking as a shield between himself and the world. When he had something to say, he said it. She learned, gradually and with some surprise that she liked him. Not as a benefactor or a business partner, though he was both of those things, but as a person, as someone whose company had weight and texture, and whose quiet steadiness felt like solid ground under her feet. She also noticed that the people of Caldwell noticed them. Mrs. Beaumont, who ran the dressmaker's shop and kept careful track of the social arrangements of the town, made pointed comments about Eliza's frequency at the feed store that were wrapped in the sweet gauze of concern, but had a sharper purpose underneath. The sheriff, a taciturn man named Holloway who was scrupulously fair in a town that required constant fairness management, tipped his hat to Eliza with an expression that suggested he was doing arithmetic about her circumstances. There was also the matter of Frank Curran, who owned the land adjacent to the Hawthorne property on the east side, and who had made it clear in January, when James was barely cold, that he was interested in purchasing Eliza's 40 acres. He came by the farm in early April with the easy confidence of a man who expected eventually to get what he wanted, and he sat at her kitchen table with his hat in his hands and talked about how hard it was for a woman alone to manage that kind of land, and how he would give her a fair price, and how she might consider the wisdom of simplifying her situation. Eliza had given him coffee and listened with the patience of a woman who has learned that outright anger, while satisfying, is not always strategically sound, and then she had told him, with complete politeness, that she was not selling, that her farm was doing fine, and that she appreciated his visit, but she was very busy with the planting. He had left with his hat and his smile and a look in his eyes that suggested he believed this was not the last conversation they would have on this subject. She mentioned the visit to Elijah the next time she came to town, partly because she was still irritated about it, and partly because she found, increasingly, that talking to him was where she went when she needed to think something through. Elijah listened to her account of Curran's visit with a stillness that she had begun to recognize as the mode he adopted when something had annoyed him, and he was being deliberate about how he expressed it. "Curran has been trying to expand east for 2 years," he said when she finished. "He's made offers on 3 other farms that border his land, got 2 of them." "Well, he won't get mine," Eliza said. "No," Elijah agreed, with a certainty that felt less like reassurance and more like a statement of fact, and she found she was grateful for it. The spring wore into early summer, and the wheat came up green and true and straight, and the corn followed behind it in its own time, and Eliza walked her fields in the mornings with something close to joy in her chest, the particular joy of a farmer who has worried and worked and is now watching the earth keep its side of the agreement. Thomas had a name for every row of corn. Ruth had decided that the chickens were her personal responsibility and managed them with a dedication that was both charming and slightly terrifying in its seriousness. Eliza was mending fence on the east boundary one Saturday in late June when she heard the sound of a horse on the road and looked up to see Elijah riding toward her on a solid gray mare. He was not in his customary store attire. He wore a work shirt and riding trousers and looked, Eliza thought with a slight disorganization of her thoughts, considerably more at ease on horseback than she had expected, though she was not sure why she had not expected it. He pulled up at the fence and looked at the section she was working on and then at the tools beside her on the ground. "Heard from Abernathy at the hardware store that you'd been buying fencing supplies," he said. "Thought I'd ride out and see how it's going." "It's going slowly," she said honestly. "This section's been damaged by something. I think cattle got into the east pasture and pushed through, possibly Curran's cattle." Elijah swung down from the horse without ceremony. "Show me what you're working with." He spent the next 2 hours helping her repair the fence, and Eliza watched him work and thought that there was something about a person's character that became visible in physical work, in the way they approached a problem, whether they were patient or hasty, whether they paid attention or cut corners. Elijah worked the way he talked, steadily and without waste, with a quiet focus that got things done well and did not feel the need to announce itself. They took a break in the shade of the cottonwood at the corner of the east pasture, and Eliza brought water from the bucket she had left there that morning, and they sat on the ground with their backs against the tree and drank and looked out at the fields. The wheat moved in the light wind like something breathing. The sky was enormous and blue, as Kansas skies always are, as if the sky in Kansas cannot be contained to the same dimensions as sky anywhere else. "It looks good," he said. He meant the wheat. "It does," she said. She felt a warmth spreading through her that was not entirely the summer heat. "I was afraid all spring. Every time the weather turned cold, I thought about what it would mean if the crop failed, but it didn't." "It doesn't always," he said. "Sometimes things work out." She looked at him. He was looking at the fields, his brown eyes steady and warm in the slanted light, and she was aware of him, of the fact of him, with a sharpness that was both pleasant and frightening. She was aware of his hands resting on his knees, and the way the light caught the angle of his jaw, and how close they were sitting in the shadow of the cottonwood, and she felt the familiar grief-guilt that came whenever she became aware of any man in this particular way, the reflexive sense that she was being disloyal to James, that allowing herself to feel anything was a betrayal. But James, who had loved her completely, had also told her once, during an ice storm in the winter of their 4th year when they had talked all night about everything, that the worst thing he could imagine for her was a life spent alone being faithful to his memory at the expense of her own happiness. He had said it in the light-hearted way that people say serious things when they do not want to alarm each other, and she had said something about how she wasn't planning on him dying, and they had both laughed. She had not thought of it in a long time. She thought of it now. "Mr. Maddox," she said, because she had something to say and she was going to say it. "Elijah," he said. It was not the first time he had offered his given name. She had been careful in her own way about using it. "Elijah," she said. She looked at the fields rather than at him. "I want you to know that I am grateful for what you did, with the grain, and the ring, and the arrangement you proposed. You treated me with dignity when you could have simply made a transaction, and I have not forgotten that." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the wheat. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "I did what made sense." "Not everyone does what makes sense," she said. "No," he agreed. "That's true enough." She made herself look at him then, and he was already looking at her, and they held that look for a moment that was longer than it needed to be and shorter than she wanted it to be. And then she stood up and said they should probably finish the fence before the light got bad, and he agreed and stood up and they went back to work. That evening, when he had ridden back toward Caldwell, Eliza sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, and watched the fireflies begin to appear in the fields and thought about that look, and what it meant, and what she wanted it to mean, and whether wanting things for herself was allowed, yet or whether she needed more time, or whether time was simply the excuse she was using to avoid the terrifying possibility that she was beginning to care for someone new. July arrived hot and urgent and full of work. Eliza hired the 2 Garrett boys from the neighboring farm to help with the summer maintenance, paying them in meals and the small wages she managed from selling eggs in town. And between the 5 of them, the farm moved through its summer obligations with reasonable efficiency. The corn was standing tall by the middle of the month, and the wheat was heading out beautifully, and Frank Curran came by again in the last week of July, this time with a slightly higher offer and the same underlying presumption, and Eliza sent him away again with the same complete politeness and equally complete firmness. Elijah came out twice more that month on the pretense of checking on the crops, which was not an entirely false pretense since they did in fact discuss the crops each time at considerable length, but which Eliza began to understand was also something else. A man finding reasons to be in a place where a particular woman was, and she found that she was finding reasons to come to town slightly more often than strictly necessary. And she thought they were both probably aware of this, and choosing not to remark on it directly yet, which was its own kind of conversation. On the second of his July visits, Thomas asked Elijah if he knew how to fish, and Elijah said he knew somewhat. And Thomas, with the relentless social ambition of a 7-year-old, announced that there was a good fishing hole at the bend of the creek that marked the south edge of the property, and that they should go. Eliza had watched this unfold with a mixture of amusement and something more complicated, because Thomas had not shown sustained interest in any adult man since his father died, and the sight of him looking up at Elijah with that particular hopeful attention made her chest ache in a way that was not entirely painful. They went to the creek. All four of them, Eliza and Elijah and Thomas and Ruth, who declared she was not interested in fishing but was interested in the creek generally, and spent the time building an elaborate dam from sticks and mud with the focused ambition of a small civil engineer. Thomas caught a catfish and was beside himself with pride. Elijah helped him land it and taught him how to properly hold the line and what the difference in tension meant for the size of the fish. And he did all of this with the patient, unhurried manner of someone who had not assumed he would be doing this today but found, now that he was doing it, that it was exactly the right thing to be doing. Eliza sat on the bank and watched and thought, here is a man who would be good at this, at all of this. She pulled the thought back before it could go any further and focused on the movement of the water and the sound of her children being happy, which was a sound she had missed without realizing how much she had missed it. When they were walking back to the house in the long golden light of the late afternoon, Thomas fell asleep standing up and leaned against Elijah's leg, and Elijah looked down at him with an expression that Eliza saw because she was watching, an expression of surprised tenderness, of a man encountering something he had not expected to feel and finding he had no resistance to it. Elijah left before supper, as he always did, because he was careful and she was grateful for his care, because the people of Caldwell were already talking, and she was not ready yet for the weight of their attention. The pressure of other people's expectations added to the pressure of her own feelings. August brought the harvest closer, and with it a new kind of anxiety, the anxiety of hoping that all the work and all the planning would translate into the numbers she needed. She spent evenings doing arithmetic at the kitchen table by lamplight after the children were in bed, calculating what the wheat would sell for at current prices, what she owed Elijah, what she needed for the winter, what she could set aside. The numbers were manageable, not generous but manageable. She would be all right. The farm would be all right. She came into town on a Thursday morning in mid-August to ask Elijah about current grain prices and found the feed store locked, which had never happened during business hours before. She stood in front of the door feeling a small, irrational alarm, and then she heard his voice from the side alley and followed it, and found him in conversation with two men she did not recognize. Men who had the road-worn, weathered look of men who lived on horseback, and not on any particular piece of land. They were speaking in low voices and stopped when she appeared. Elijah looked at her. Something moved quickly across his face and then settled back into its customary steadiness. "Eliza, give me a moment." She waited at the front of the store. The conversation in the alley lasted a few more minutes, and then the two men walked away in the direction of Delaware Street without looking back, and Elijah came around the corner and unlocked the feed store with his jaw set in a way she had not seen before. Inside, he answered her questions about grain prices with his usual precision, but she could see that his attention was partially elsewhere, and finally she said, "Who were those men?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "They came from a man named Vane, Cole Vane. He runs a supply operation out of Wichita. He's been buying up grain contracts in advance of harvest, paying below market now to lock farmers into selling cheap later, then reselling at full price. He wanted my cooperation to identify which farms would be desperate enough to agree." Eliza's stomach went cold. She thought of her calculations. She thought of all the farms in the county. She thought of how many women and men had made it through this winter and were counting on this harvest to make them whole again. "What did you tell them?" she said. "I told them no," he said. He said it flatly, without any particular drama, the way he said everything. I also told them that if I heard of any of my customers being approached with that arrangement, I would be having a conversation with Sheriff Holloway about what they were doing. Eliza looked at him. He was standing behind his counter, his hands flat on the wooden surface, and he looked back at her with those steady brown eyes, and she felt something shift in her chest like a key turning in a lock. She thought about the ring on the counter in March, and the grain he had loaded without hesitation, and the fence he had helped her repair, and the way he had watched her son sleep against his leg with that unguarded look of unexpected tenderness. She thought about what it meant to be a person who consistently did the right thing not because anyone was watching but because it was simply what they did, because it was simply who they were. She thought about James, who had been that kind of person. She thought about how rare it was. "Elijah," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at her hands, which were folded together on the counter between them. "I don't want to make this awkward. I know that our arrangement is a business arrangement, and I know that I am still in a situation where you have been generous to me, and I am still, technically, working to repay that. And I want you to know that none of what I'm about to say is in any way connected to any of that. I want to say it anyway because I think it's honest and I believe in being honest." He was very still. He was watching her with that full, unguarded attention, and she could see that he understood where this was going and that he was letting her get there. "I find that I look forward to seeing you," she said, "more than is strictly explained by our business dealings, and I believe you feel something similar. And I am not going to pretend that I am not still grieving James, because I am, and I think I will be for a long time, and that is the truth of it. But I also think I am ready to admit that grief and care for another person can exist in the same heart at the same time, and I am not going to be afraid of that anymore." The silence afterward was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something settling. Elijah came around the counter slowly, not with any rush or urgency, but with the deliberate steadiness that was entirely characteristic of him. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at her with an expression that was open in a way his face was not always open, and she could see in it both the depth of what he felt and the care he was taking with it. "Eliza," he said, "I have thought about how to say this more times than I should probably admit. I am going to say it plainly because I don't know any other way. When you walked into this store in March with your ring in your hand and your chin up like that, and you set it on this counter and asked for what you needed without apologizing for needing it, I thought I had never seen anything so brave or so beautiful in my life. And everything since then has only confirmed what I thought then. I care for you. I care for your children. I admire everything about the way you are living your life. And I would very much like if you are willing to court you properly, with your permission and at your pace." Eliza felt the warmth spread through her from the center outward, into her hands and her face, and all the way to her feet standing on the dusty floor of the feed store. And she thought that this was what being known felt like. Not the performed version of yourself you showed the world, but the actual version, the one that had walked a mile and a half into town with a gold ring in her pocket and her heart in her boots, and she thought she had missed being known. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He smiled at her then, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him, not the almost smile she had come to recognize but the whole thing, and it transformed his face in a way that made her catch her breath slightly, because under the quiet steadiness and the practical competence there was this, a warmth that was generous and undefended, and she understood that this was the version of Elijah Maddox that very few people got to see, and she was glad, quietly and deeply glad, that she was going to be one of them. They were careful with it. They were both people who had learned, through different experiences, the value of doing things right rather than fast, and so they did not rush. He came to the farm on Sunday afternoons when the week's work allowed it and sat on the porch and talked with her while the children played in the yard. And they talked about everything. The farm and the town and the state of the cattle market and the newspaper accounts of what was happening further east and what it meant for people out here. And they talked about their pasts, which were not simple. He told her about his parents who had died when he was 19 and left him with a small inheritance and a need to build something of his own. She told him about her family in Ohio who had thought she was making a mistake coming west and who had been, in some ways, right about the difficulty of it, but had not understood that the difficulty was not the point. He met her children fully in those Sunday afternoons. He was not trying to be a replacement for James, and he did not attempt anything of the sort. And Thomas, who was old enough to have complicated feelings about any man spending time with his mother, seemed to sense this and respond to it with a gradual, careful opening that was its own kind of gift. Ruth, who was 5 and operated on simpler and more decisive emotional logic, had decided she liked Elijah by the second Sunday and conducted herself accordingly, climbing onto the porch railing while he sat below her and informing him at length about the personalities of her chickens. In September, the harvest came. It came better than Eliza had dared to hope. The wheat yield was strong, the corn was solid, and she stood at the edge of her south field on a bright September morning watching the Garrett boys help bring in the harvest and felt a completeness that she had not felt in 9 months. Not happiness exactly, because the grief was still there, woven into everything the way grief is, but a sense of having done what she set out to do, of having brought the thing through, of her farm still standing and still producing and still hers. She brought the surplus grain to Maddox feed and grain on a wagon she drove herself, with Thomas beside her on the seat, and Elijah came out of the store when he heard the wagon and looked at the load in the back and looked at her face, and something in his expression opened with a quiet, deep pleasure. "How's it looking?" he said. "Better than I planned for," she said. She was smiling, and it felt good to smile, and she let it. He helped her unload the grain, and he weighed it, and he ran the numbers, and she watched his face as he did the arithmetic, and she knew from the way his expression settled what the outcome was going to be before he told her. "You've paid off the debt," he said. "And then some. I owe you the difference." She had not expected the surplus. She had planned for breaking even. The fact that there was extra, that she had actually overshot her projection, was almost too good to absorb standing there in the September sun. "I'll apply it to next year's seed," she said, because she was already thinking about next year, about what she would plant differently and what she would keep the same, and this felt like important information about where her head was, that it was already pointed toward next year, toward the future of the farm and everything on it. Elijah looked at her steadily. "Next year and everything after," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was about more than grain accounts, and she heard it and felt it land in the center of her chest like something finding its place. October moved in gold and rust across the Kansas plain, and Eliza and Elijah walked the perimeter of her property one afternoon, not to inspect anything in particular, but simply to walk together in the autumn air with the harvested fields around them, and the sky turning the deep blue of October above. And Elijah asked her questions about the land with the genuine interest of a man who was learning something he intended to understand well. And she asked him about the store and the way he saw it growing, and they talked about all of it with the ease of two people who have run out of the need to perform anything for each other and can simply be. He stopped at the corner of the east fence line, the section they had repaired together in June, and he looked at the wood and the wire and the neat, solid line of it against the October grass. "Holds up well," he said. "It does," she said. She was standing beside him. The wind was cool and clean and smelled of dry grass and the coming cold. "Elijah." "Yes." She did not know how to make a graceful move toward what she wanted to say, and so she chose the direct approach, which was the approach she had found most reliable in her life generally. "Have you thought about what comes next, for us, I mean, beyond the courting?" He turned to look at her, and his face had that full, open quality that she had come to think of as specifically hers, the version of him that he had not shown the rest of the world. "I have thought about it considerably," he said. "I did not want to rush you." "You haven't rushed me," she said. "I asked because I am ready to talk about it, if you are." He looked at her for a long moment in the October light, and then he said, "I would like to marry you, Eliza, if that is what you are asking about. I would like to marry you and be a husband to you, and whatever kind of father your children allow me to be, and I would like to make a life on this farm with you, because this land is yours and your family's and it should stay that way. I would move operations here if that made sense, or find another arrangement. But I want to be where you are, and I want to do it honestly and permanently." She looked at him, this man who had returned her ring when she had offered it as payment, who had treated her grief with respect and her capability with faith, who had sat on her porch in the summer evenings and talked to her about real things and looked at her like she was the most important part of any landscape she stood in. "That is exactly what I am asking about," she said. "And yes, I would like that very much." He took her hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, and held it in his large, careful hand, and they stood at the corner of the east fence line in the October wind and made, without any formal ceremony or witness, the essential agreement that was the foundation of everything else. They were married in the first week of December of that year, 1878, in the Methodist Church in Caldwell, with the minister who played chess with Elijah on Thursday evenings officiating, and about 30 people from the town and the surrounding farms in attendance. Thomas stood very straight beside his mother during the ceremony, wearing the good shirt Eliza had stayed up 2 nights altering to fit him, and Ruth wore a ribbon in her hair and held a bunch of dried wildflowers that she had insisted on preparing herself. The church smelled of pine boughs and candle wax and the cold, clean air of a Kansas December. When the minister asked if there were any impediments to the union, Frank Curran, who had apparently attended out of the conviction that his presence and disapproval had some social weight, made a sound from the third row. Sheriff Holloway, who was sitting directly behind him, leaned forward and said something very quietly in his ear, and Frank Curran made no further sounds for the remainder of the service. Elijah put a new ring on Eliza's finger. She still wore James's ring, which was now on a chain around her neck, because she had talked with Elijah about it, and he had said, simply and without hesitation, that James had been part of her life and her children's life, and that honoring that was not a problem for him but a mark of good character. And she had thought again what it meant to be with someone who understood the complexity of real things. The reception was held in the church hall and featured pie from 6 different farm wives, and whiskey for those who wanted it, and a fiddle player from the south side of town, who was not precisely talented, but was enthusiastically committed. And it was warm and loud and full of people who were genuinely glad for the occasion, because Caldwell was the kind of town that knew what it was to be hard, and took its celebrations where it could find them. Thomas ate 3 pieces of pie and fell asleep in a corner chair, and Ruth danced with extraordinary commitment if not with particular technical accuracy, and Eliza danced with her husband in the warm light of the church hall and felt, fully and without apology, happy. Not the simple happiness of someone who has not known loss, but the deeper, more durable happiness of someone who has known loss and found, on the other side of it, that the capacity for joy had not been extinguished but only banked, waiting for the right conditions to come back up to full flame. They went home that evening to the farm, the 4 of them in the wagon with the cold stars brilliant overhead and the horse's breath making small clouds in the winter air, and the children fell asleep against each other before they were halfway home, and Eliza sat beside her husband on the wagon seat with his arm around her shoulders against the cold, and she thought about the morning in March when she had walked into the feed store with her heart in her boots and her ring in her pocket, and how none of what she had now had been visible from there, and how the road between that morning and this evening had been built from one small, brave decision at a time. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was cold but manageable, and they managed it together. Elijah moved the essential operations of the feed store's secondary business, the ordering and accounting side, into the farmhouse's second bedroom, which had been used for storage, and he drove to town 3 days a week to run the store itself, and was home for the other 4. The arrangement required some negotiation, which they did with the straightforward practicality of 2 people who had spent their adult lives solving practical problems, and by February they had found a rhythm that worked, and it was better than either of them had been separately, because that is the nature of the right kind of partnership. Thomas thawed fully by Christmas. He accepted Elijah not as a replacement for his father, but as something new and different, and its own kind of valuable, the specific way a child accepts a reality that is offered with patience and honesty rather than pressure. He began asking Elijah questions about everything, about how things were built and how the feed business worked, and what the different cattle breeds were that moved through Caldwell on the trail drives. And Elijah answered all of it with the same serious, complete attention he gave to everything. And Eliza watched this developing conversation between them with a love that was almost impossible to contain in her chest. Ruth had decided by the beginning of winter that Elijah was hers in some essential and non-negotiable way, and she managed her ownership of this fact with considerable confidence. She sat beside him at dinner and made sure he had enough of whatever she deemed important, and updated him daily on the status of the chickens, which remained under her personal governance. Elijah accepted all of this with the kind of quiet, steady love that did not need to announce itself. Spring came again, as it always does on the prairie, with a sudden headlong rush after a long patience, and Eliza stood at her kitchen window in March of 1879 and looked out at the fields and felt the anticipation of planting season with a joy that was different from last year, fuller, more grounded, because she was not standing at the edge of an abyss this time, but in the center of a life that had real walls and a real floor and was hers. Elijah came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders and looked out the window with her at the fields. "Ready for it," he said. "More than ready," she said. She turned and looked up at him in the morning light, and he looked down at her with those warm brown eyes, and she put her hand against the side of his face, and he leaned into it slightly. And they stood there in the kitchen of the farm that was theirs, with the smell of coffee, and the sound of the children beginning to wake in their rooms. And the quiet between them was the quiet of 2 people who have found each other, and do not need to fill the space with anything. The planting of 1879 was the most organized and ambitious Eliza had ever undertaken. With Elijah's practical support and an additional $10 put toward the spring seed purchase, they expanded the planted acreage and tried a 3rd variety, a red winter wheat that Elijah had been tracking in the agricultural papers that came to the store, and they planted it together, walking the rows in the bright spring days with the children running ahead of them and the sky open and enormous and blue above. It was on one of those planting days, a Thursday in late April, that the coal vein situation came to a head. 2 of Vane's men came to the farm. Not the same 2 who had approached Elijah in August, but a different pair with a different approach, which was to say they were less conversational and more explicitly threatening, making reference to what happened to crops that were not properly tended and to farms that caught fire in dry summers. Eliza came out of the barn with a pitchfork in her hand and looked at them with a steadiness that surprised them, because they had apparently expected a woman alone, not understanding that alone was no longer a condition that applied. She sent Thomas to town at a run before the men had finished delivering their message, and Elijah arrived with Sheriff Holloway 40 minutes later, which was approximately the time it took for the 2 men to have exhausted their immediate threat-making and be standing in the yard looking considerably less certain of themselves than when they had arrived. Sheriff Holloway, who was a man of few words but reliable action, had a conversation with them that ended with them riding out of the county and, by all subsequent accounts, not returning. Coal Vane's operation was investigated by federal authorities later that year, as the complaints from farmers across several counties had begun to accumulate beyond what local law enforcement could absorb, and it was dismantled with a thoroughness that suggested the authorities had been looking for exactly this kind of case. Elijah gave a formal statement about what had been proposed to him in August, and 3 other feed store owners from the region gave similar statements, and Vane found himself facing consequences that were both legal and reputational and significantly curtailed his ability to continue in his chosen enterprise. Frank Curran made one more attempt on the Hawthorne land, not through threat but through an offer that was, Eliza admitted, actually fairly close to market value, which suggested he had revised his strategy based on new information about her resolve. She turned him down with the same completeness as before and a slightly greater economy of words, and he did not come back after that. The summer of 1879 was good. The farm was good. The harvest in September was the best the land had produced since James first broke the ground, and Eliza stood in the south field watching the grain come in and felt the sum total of everything, the loss and the survival and the unlikely, irreplaceable gift of a man who had returned a ring with a sack of grain and started something entirely unexpected. And she felt, from the ground up through her feet and into her whole body, profoundly and completely grateful for all of it. She also noticed, in the way that a woman notices things about her own body after having carried 2 children, that something was different about the September mornings. She was tired in a specific way, and the smell of coffee, which she loved, was suddenly difficult to be around. And she lay in the early morning dark one day counting backward and arrived at a number that made her lie very still with her hand on her flat stomach and her heart beating fast and unsteady. She told Elijah on a Sunday evening when the children were in bed and the lamp was burning low on the kitchen table, and they were sitting together with the comfortable intimacy of 2 people who have shared a winter and a planting season and a harvest and all the daily substance of a life. She said, "I think we are going to have a baby." She said it directly, because that was how she said things, and watched his face. The thing that moved across Elijah Maddox's face at those words was not something she had ever seen on him before. It was beyond his usual steady warmth. It was something almost uncontainable, a joy that seemed to come from a depth in him that had not been visible before, and he sat across the table from her for a moment just feeling it, not trying to manage or moderate it, and then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it with a careful, complete attention. "Eliza," he said. He stopped. He tried again. "I did not know I wanted this until right now." "I suspected," she said, "that you wanted it without knowing it." He laughed, and it was the full, warm laugh she loved, the one that came out when something genuinely delighted him. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, and he held her with the care of a man who has been given something he intends to protect without restricting, and she put her face against his shoulder and let herself be held, which was something she was still learning how to allow, this falling into someone else's strength without losing her own. The winter of 1879 passed with the farm settled and warm and full in the particular way of a house that has more life in it than it has loneliness. Thomas turned 8 in November, and Elijah gave him his first proper pocket knife with a carved handle, and sat with him for an entire afternoon, teaching him the appropriate use and care of it, which Thomas absorbed with the serious attention he gave to everything Elijah taught him. Ruth turned 6 in December and had opinions about her birthday dinner that were expressed with great energy, and that Eliza and Elijah accommodated with the patient amusement of parents who understand that strong opinions in a small person are not a problem but a feature. Eliza's middle grew through the winter, and the farm life adjusted around it with the practical pragmatism of people who have always understood that life does not pause for inconvenience, but simply requires adaptation. Elijah took on more of the heavier work without being asked, which she appreciated, and she directed operations from positions that did not require her to carry heavy things or work in the cold more than necessary, and it was a reasonable arrangement. The baby came on a Wednesday morning in early April of 1880, with the spring planting season just beginning to announce itself, and the smell of new earth coming through the bedroom window, which Eliza had insisted be left open because she needed the air. Elijah had ridden to town the night before to bring back the doctor and the doctor's wife who attended births, and the doctor's wife was a calm, capable woman named Mrs. Partridge, who had been attending births in this county for 15 years, and who ran the labor with quiet authority. It was a boy. A solid, long boy with a red face and a powerful voice and dark hair like his father's. And when the doctor put him in Eliza's arms, she looked at him and felt the specific, enormous love that only comes with a new child. A love that does not replace anything that came before it but simply adds itself to what was already there, enlarging the whole. Elijah was allowed in after a short wait, and he came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby in Eliza's arms with that same uncontainable joy she had seen on his face in September when she told him, and he touched the baby's face with one careful finger, and the baby, in the arbitrary and significant way of newborns, turned his head toward the touch. "What shall we call him?" Elijah asked. Eliza had been thinking about this for several months. She had talked to Elijah about the possibility of James as a middle name, to honor the man who had built the farm they were living in and who had been father to the 2 sleeping children in the next room, and Elijah had said yes without hesitation, which she had loved him for. For the first name she had been turning options over in her mind through the winter months. "Samuel," she said. "Samuel James Maddox." Elijah looked at her with that full, warm expression. "That's a good name," he said. "That's a very good name." Thomas, when he was allowed in later that morning, examined his half-brother with the combination of fascination and responsibility that older siblings feel, and immediately announced that he would teach Samuel everything he knew, which at 8 years old was already considerable. Ruth, who had been informed she was now a big sister with some ceremony, looked at the baby for a long time with a calculating expression that suggested she was revising her previous understanding of the household's dynamics. "He's very small," she said finally. "He'll grow," Eliza said. "I will be in charge of him," Ruth decided. "We'll see about that," Elijah said with the almost smile. "We will see," Ruth agreed, in a tone that suggested she already knew the outcome. The spring of 1880 moved forward with the farm and its expanded household, and Eliza planted with Elijah beside her and Samuel in the basket. She carried to the field or left in the shade with Thomas appointed as guardian, and the wheat went into the ground in its rows and the corn followed, and the sky was enormous above them, and the Kansas wind moved through everything, through the fields and the cottonwood trees and the washing on the line, and the farm was alive in every direction. The feed store in Caldwell continued to operate, run during the week by a young man named Percy Dillard whom Elijah had trained over the previous year, and who had the kind of conscientious reliability that made delegation possible. Elijah went to town twice a week and was otherwise on the farm, and this arrangement suited everyone including Percy, who was building his own reputation as someone who understood the grain business and treated customers with fairness. It was in the summer of 1880 that Eliza made a decision she had been considering for some time. She wrote to her family in Ohio. She had maintained intermittent correspondence with her mother through the years of her marriage and through the year after James died, but the letters had been careful and contained, and she had not told them most of what had happened, only that she had managed and that the children were well. Now she wrote a long letter, several pages, telling the whole story, the ring and the grain and Elijah, and the harvest and the autumn courtship and the wedding, and Thomas and Ruth and Samuel, and the farm in all its four-season reality, and the life she had built, and the life she was living, and how it was harder and more beautiful and more fully hers than anything she had imagined in Ohio as a girl pressing wildflowers into a journal. Her mother wrote back 6 weeks later, A letter that was generous and honest about the fear they had felt for her and the relief they felt now. And that included a pressed flower from her mother's garden that arrived slightly crumbled but still recognizable. And Eliza cried over this letter in a way she had not cried in a long time. A clean, releasing kind of crying that felt like the last of something being let go. The correspondence that followed was different from what had come before. Warmer. More real. Her mother asked questions about Elijah that were specific rather than polite, which meant she was genuinely curious, and Eliza answered them with the pleasure of someone describing something they are proud of. Her mother sent a small package for Samuel with a knitted blanket inside, and a note that said she hoped to meet him someday, and Eliza set the blanket in the baby's cradle with a hand that was not quite steady. In the fall of 1880, the harvest was again strong, and Eliza's surplus grain went to the store accounts, and then, for the first time, a small amount went into actual savings. Not very much, but some. She held the amount in her mind as she did the books at the kitchen table, and thought about what it meant to have a small cushion between the farm and disaster, a small margin of safety, and it felt like the beginning of something she had not been able to imagine in March of 1878. Elijah sat across from her while she did the books, reading the agricultural paper with Samuel asleep in his lap, which was Samuel's preferred sleeping location outside of his cradle. And Eliza looked up from the numbers at the two of them across the table and felt the specific happiness of a moment that she knew she was fully living even as she lived it, the happiness of everything being exactly as it should be. "We should talk about the East Field," she said, because she had been thinking about it and she always talked to him about what she was thinking about the farm. "The drainage issue," he said, without looking up from his paper because he had been thinking about it too. "And the soil quality in the northeast corner. I think it would respond well to a different approach, maybe alternating with a legume crop to fix the nitrogen back into the ground." He set the paper down and looked at her with the full attention that meant they were about to have a real conversation. "I was reading about that. There's a soybean variety they've been experimenting with in Missouri that might work well here." "Tell me about it," she said. They talked for an hour about the East Field and soil chemistry and crop rotation, and the economics of trying new varieties versus sticking with what was proven, and Samuel slept through all of it, and the lamp burned steady on the table, and outside the Kansas night was dark and full of stars, and the farm was quiet in every direction. The years that followed had their difficulties, because this was the frontier and difficulty was part of the landscape. There was a drought summer in 1882 that cut the harvest by a third, and required the careful management of resources that Eliza had become expert in. And there was an illness that moved through the children's school in the winter of 1881 that kept Thomas in bed for 2 weeks and frightened them both badly before he recovered. And there was the ongoing negotiation of a community that was itself changing. As the cattle drives that had been the economic heartbeat of Caldwell began to diminish, as the railroad changed the logistics of the cattle trade, and the town had to find new ways to sustain itself. Through all of it, the farm kept producing, and the feed store adapted, and Eliza and Elijah worked through each challenge with the same straightforward partnership that had characterized everything between them from the beginning. They disagreed sometimes, because they were both people with strong opinions and the courage to express them, and their disagreements were honest and sometimes heated and always resolved, because they had both chosen each other with their eyes fully open, and they did not retreat from that choice when things got complicated. In 1883, Ruth turned 10 and Thomas was 12 and Samuel was 3, and Eliza was 33 years old, and she looked at her family at the dinner table on a Sunday evening in October and took stock. The farm was strong. The children were healthy and flourishing in their different ways. Thomas increasingly interested in the agricultural science side of what they were doing. Ruth with ambitions that were not yet fully articulated, but were clearly pointed outward toward the world with great intention. Samuel, who was energetic and curious, and utterly without fear in the way of 3-year-olds, and who treated the farm animals as personal friends. Elijah was beside her, his arm sometimes along the back of her chair, his voice joining the conversation with the ease of a man who is completely at home. There was one more baby, a daughter, born in the summer of 1884, who arrived in June with the heat of a Kansas summer around her, and who had Eliza's dark hair and Elijah's brown eyes and a voice that was, from the very beginning, entirely her own. They named her Clara Ruth Maddox, the middle name for her sister who had been present at the birth, and had managed the event with the executive authority she brought to all things. "She looks like you," Elijah said, holding Clara in the lamplight of the evening after, when the house was quiet and both of them were tired and the baby was sleeping against his chest. "She has your eyes," Eliza said. "She has the best of both of us," he said, with the simplicity of a man who believes what he is saying. "Yes," Eliza agreed. "I think she does." She leaned against his shoulder and looked at the sleeping face of their daughter and thought about the March morning in 1878, when she had set a ring on a counter and asked for what she needed, not knowing that in asking for grain she was setting in motion everything that had led to this room, this man, these children, this life. The ring James had given her still hung on its chain around her neck. It was part of her, part of everything she was. And the life she had built since was not a replacement for the life she had lived before, but a continuation of it, an honoring of all that James had believed she was capable of, and all that she had, against difficult odds, proven herself to be. In the summer of 1885, Eliza Hawthorne Maddox stood at the edge of her south field in the long evening light with the wheat moving around her like a breathing thing, and she thought about all of it, the full length and breadth of it, all the way back to the beginning, to the girl who had pressed wildflowers into a journal and come west with her whole life ahead of her and her heart wide open. She thought about James, who had given her the beginning. She thought about Elijah, who had given her the continuation. She thought about Thomas and Ruth and Samuel and Clara, who were the whole point of everything. Elijah came up beside her from the direction of the barn and stood next to her in the evening light, and they were quiet together for a moment the way they were quiet together, completely and comfortably. "Good stand of wheat," he said. "The best yet," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they looked out at the field together, at the land that she had fought for and kept, at the grain that was standing tall in the gold light, at the sky that was turning pink and orange at the edge of the world in the way that Kansas skies do in summer evenings, as if the sky is showing off a little, as if it knows it is beautiful and wants to make sure you see it. "Happy," he said, not as if he needed to be reassured, as if he simply wanted to know. She thought about the word. She thought about everything it contained in this particular moment, standing in this particular field beside this particular man. "Yes," she said, "completely." He pulled her closer and she let herself be pulled, and the evening moved over the farm in its golden way. And somewhere in the house, Ruth was calling something to Thomas, and Samuel was probably underfoot in the kitchen, and Clara was likely experimenting with something she was not supposed to be experimenting with. And the chickens were settling in for the night, and the horses were in the barn, and the field stretched out in every direction, full and ready and thoroughly, completely theirs. The ring on the chain at Eliza's throat caught the evening light for a moment, gold against her skin, a piece of the past she carried with gratitude and without grief anymore. The ring on her finger was a different ring, a broader one that Elijah had put there on a December morning in front of 30 people, and a fiddle player with more enthusiasm than skill, and it fit perfectly, the way things fit when they are made for each other, or when two people make themselves fit for each other through patience and honesty and the daily, accumulated work of choosing. The sun went down over the Kansas plain, and the stars came out one by one into the enormous sky, and the farm was quiet and alive, and everything in it was exactly where it was supposed to be. Inside the house, Elijah put Samuel to bed with the story of the catfish at the creek, a story that had been considerably embellished over time, and now involved at least 4 additional catfish and 1 very surprised heron. And Samuel, who had heard it 40 times, listened with the same rapt attention as the first time because that is the nature of good stories. And Eliza put Clara down and checked on Ruth, who was reading by candlelight, and told her another 15 minutes, and then the light goes out, and she stopped in Thomas's doorway and looked at her oldest boy, who was 12 now, and had the beginning of his father's serious eyes and his stepfather's quiet capability, and she felt the full weight of love for all of them, this specific and irreplaceable collection of people who were her life. She came to bed last, as she usually did, and Elijah was already there, reading the agricultural paper by lamplight because he was always reading the agricultural paper, and he looked up when she came in, and his face did the thing it always did when he looked at her. That slight opening, that particular warmth, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, how extraordinary it was that a man could look at you like that after years of ordinary life. After all the difficulties and the repetitions and the small daily frictions that are part of any real thing, and still mean it completely. She sat on the edge of the bed and he set the paper aside and she said, "Clara managed to get into the flour barrel again. 3rd time this week," he said. "I think she's doing it on purpose," Eliza said. "She probably is," he said. "She comes by that honestly." Eliza looked at him. "What is that supposed to mean?" He smiled, the full smile that was specifically hers. "It means she is exactly like her mother." She laughed, and the laugh was real and warm and filled the room, and he reached out and tucked a piece of her hair back from her face with the comfortable intimacy of a man who has done this 10,000 times and will do it 10,000 more. And she covered his hand with hers for a moment, and they looked at each other in the lamplight of the farmhouse that had been built by a good man, and was now filled by another good man and all the life that had grown up around him. Outside, the Kansas wind moved through the wheat, steady and faithful, the same as always. The same as it would be tomorrow and the day after, through all the planting seasons and harvests yet to come, through all the mornings that would come up gold over the south field, through all the years of this life that had been made from the most ordinary and extraordinary materials. A ring, a sack of grain, a moment of dignity offered and received, and 2 people who had been brave enough when the moment came to reach toward something new. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.